You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. I'm your host, Matt. Today, we are talking with another author, but we're going to be talking about another author with this author. And then later, we will have this author on to talk about what he has authored. But you'll understand why we're doing it in this order, I think, in a second. Well, here's the man, Jeff Shara. Now you get it, right? Because Michael came first, and if it weren't for the Killer Angels, I don't think a lot of us would be as into Gettysburg as we are, because that was kind of like the gateway drug. That or the movie Gettysburg, which was based on the Killer Angels. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Ever since we started this, people have been saying, you need to get Jeff Shaara on you. I'm like, well, get me in touch with him. And then I bumped into you at the cemetery. Right. We were I think that day we were picking out flags, taking the flags out that we had put in. No, we were putting them out. We were putting them out? Yeah. Okay. Either way, we were putting them out, and I accosted you because I figured captive audience, you can't run away because that would make him look weird. So
it's all right. I do it all the time.
Well, so you didn't run away though, and here we are. So it's been a long time coming, but I'm glad that you're finally on the show.
Well, thank you.
Okay. The Killer Angels, Michael Shara, your father. First, let's talk. The name Shara is.
Well, the original spelling was S-C-I-A-R-R-A. It was Italian.
Shara.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
My great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, came through Ellis Island in 1902, and the name was changed there at Ellis Island, and the only thing we can figure is the guy behind the counter who changed the name must have been Dutch, to stick the two A's in the middle of the name, because that's sort of a Dutch thing. Okay. And of course, the rest of the family, my great-grandfather, not speaking English, said, well, we're in the new country now, and I guess that's what you do.
New name, yeah. Shed the old country.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where was he born? He was born in New Jersey, right?
Right. My father was born in Jersey City, which is where my family settled when they came over as immigrants. And there was a shoemaker. There was one of them ran a candy store. They settled very well into Jersey City.
Yeah, I'm from New Jersey too, so I feel your family's pain. So he grows up there, goes to school, and graduates from Rutgers.
Correct. Yes, 1950.
1950. He was also a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne, correct?
Correct. Yes, that was between the wars, 47 to 48.
Okay. Did he put off college to do that, or
no? He was born in 1928, so he would have been 18 in 1946. So it sort of all fell together.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then what does he do? Now, when does he get into writing? Did he go to school for writing, or what's he doing at that point?
Not at all. He majored in English, which doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a writer. Right. But he began writing while he was still in college, and he published his first short story in 1951 while he was still at Rutgers. He started out with sci-fi. He wrote a lot of sci-fi stuff. In those days, in the 50s, you had all these sort of dime novels, these pulp novels. Yeah. Or anthologies, Galaxy and Astounding, and all these things that I actually have copies of today, which is very cool. And you would get paid per word. And I can remember as a little kid counting the words in my father's story, because he would get 2 cents a word. Okay. And I remember when it went to 3 cents, that was like our ship had come in. Yeah. We're really well off now. Right. But he penned some 70 short stories, mostly in those old pulp magazines. And then later on, he began to work a little more straight fiction, police drama kind of stuff. Okay. He was published in Playboy, the Saturday Evening Post. Back in those days, a lot of magazines published fiction, short stories. They don't today, which is a shame. Yeah. And the Cosmopolitan and Red Book, and the Atlantic. These were all magazines back then that all published fiction, and he was published in every one of them.
So what was the first book that he decided to write?
He started in the early 60s writing a book it became called The Broken Place. And it's a very introspective, it's a very gloomy book. It's tough to read because it's very depressing, but it was his life. And he was a little autobiographical about a prize fighter who comes home from the Korean War, comes home as a soldier, and then goes back to prize fighting and kills a man in the ring. Which is tough enough.
Sure.
And what follows that, and that was published in 1968. It sold 0 copies. I mean, nobody was interested. Little Brown and Company was the publisher, that was a pretty big disappointment to him because he worked on this thing for years, and it was. I think he put himself out there as, well, this is me, this is my life. Who's interested? It turns out nobody was interested.
But he was a boxer.
Yes.
And he was also a cop.
Yes. He did that for about a year down in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I think he did it mainly to get experience for writing. And he wrote a short story called The Peeping Tom Patrol, which was published in Playboy. And it's part of an anthology. Then Playboy actually used that title as the title of the anthology. And he did a few other police dramas, and I think that's where he got that is by the experience of being a cop.
And how old is he at this point?
Well, born in 1928, so this was about 1954 or so. So he was in his mid-20s.
So that he would take this job to be a cop for the experience tells me that whether he had stated it or not, somewhere inside he knew that he was going to be a writer. Like that will be his life's work, is writing. Because you don't do that if you're just taking writing, casually.
Right, and I think he had really made up his mind about that even earlier than that. I think by the time he graduated from Rutgers, he never did anything else. He was a writer. He was a writer. And by the time he began to teach creative writing and literature and so forth, he used to like to say that he was a writer who taught as opposed to a teacher who writes.
Okay, I like that.
There's a big distinction.
Absolutely.
There. Yeah, and he was definitely the writer.
Yeah, we were just talking about that the other day, how when I was in college, I always liked the professors that were not actually professors, but they were professionals in whatever field it was that they're teaching a class on. I just always valued that more,
right,
with all due respect to regular old professors. But, Okay, so he has a heart attack, though, when he's 36.
Yeah, 1965.
Yeah. Heavy smoker?
4 packs a day.
Wow.
As a kid, my job every morning was to empty the ashtrays because he would stay up all night usually. And that was one of the more unpleasant things I remember from my childhood. And it's also why I was never a smoker.
Yeah, it turned you off to it.
Yeah, definitely.
It stinks.
But yeah, literally 4 packs a day and way too much coffee. And he was trotting up the steps at the English department building at FSU at Florida State, and he by the time he got to his office, he was in trouble.
Yeah,
and they called an ambulance, took him to the hospital. While he was in the hospital, literally sitting on the table, and my mother was there, he keeled over. And she says this was an article he wrote. He wrote all about this for the for American Medical Association. They gave him an award for this. It was published in the Saturday Evening Post. She heard the throat rattle, which is
death rattle. Yeah,
tough stuff.
Yeah.
He was out for 55 minutes. Now that people look at that or hear that and say, "Oh, come on, 55 minutes, you've got major brain damage."
Right.
Well, that's questionable what he had, what kind of damage he had, but it's documented, and that set a record at the time that he came back from that, and the letters he got from people wondering what was it like to be dead. Did you see the light? All of that
Sure.
stuff. He got tons of that. He mentioned in the article that while he was, the one thing he remembers is hearing the song, The Little Drummer Boy, the Christmas Carol.
Sure.
And he guessed that was because the drum was his heart.
Okay.
And he wanted to, this is very sort of surreal stuff.
Yeah.
I get that. The woman who wrote the song, who knew? We had no idea. The woman who wrote the song sent him a letter after the fact, and thanked him for mentioning the song and so forth. And his students at Florida State got together and bought him a drum, which I made great use of.
You play drums?
I played that one.
Gotcha. So he's I don't think we actually mentioned, but you've touched on it. He was after being a cop, he went and taught at Florida State.
We went to Tallahassee, and this was 1957. I was 5 years old. We went to Tallahassee because he wanted to go to the Florida State music. FSU has a tremendous music school, and he wanted to go there because he thought he could be an opera singer. No, it was not in the cards. But while he was there taking voice lessons and all this stuff, the head of the English department found out he was there, and he was a published author. So they offered him a job teaching creative writing as an instructor, the lowest rung of the ladder of professors. And so he started doing that because he could make a living doing it. Up until now, he had never made a living from his writing. My mother worked for the state of Florida for 37 years to pay the bills, because he could not pay the bills with his writing. So all of a sudden, here's a real job. I mean, that was pretty exciting.
Sure.
And he sort of grew into that role and became, I guess the pecking order is you become an assistant professor and then an associate professor. He never was a full professor and never had tenure because he didn't have the PhD. And so he didn't have the qualifications for that, the paper. And also that made him, he was not highly regarded by his peers. These sort of stodgy the old English department guys and women who had come up through the ranks of the academic, they really tossed him off, and of course he didn't have much respect for them either. So it was it was a weird relationship that he had. It didn't help them when he became the most popular professor. He was a great teacher. Yeah, I have a set of tapes. He did a guest lecture series at Mississippi State University. And I have the tapes. I put a little dinky cassette player in front of him, and a lot of people out there who are younger than me don't know what a cassette tape is. And I have them all, and we had them transcribed because it's his lecture. It's his creative writing course. Yeah. And one day I'd love to do something with that. But
come to us when you do, because we have the means,
Well, he was extremely popular as a teacher, so much so that in a year after his heart attack in 1966, he won the Coyle Moore Award at FSU for the Teacher of the Year in the entire university. Nice. That was he considered that his greatest achievement. Sure. Here's a writer first and a teacher second, and yet he's recognized for his excellence as a teacher.
Yeah, I rest my case. Yep. Yeah. So he does that, has the heart attack. And then after he recovers from the heart attack, what does he do? Well,
just prior to the heart attack in 1964, the New York World's Fair. We went as a family. We drove up to New York, saw the family, went to New Jersey and saw relatives and so forth, saw the New York World's Fair. I still have all kinds of memorabilia from that, which is pretty tacky. But and from there, we took a side trip to Gettysburg. And he did that, and I don't say this to garner accolades for myself, but he did it for the kid. He did it for me. I was the kid with the Civil War soldiers, the little plastic things you set up on the floor of your bedroom. Sure. I did that all the time, and I was interested in the Civil War as a 10-year-old. So we went to Gettysburg, and as tourists, as millions of people do now, and something happened to him. He knew a good story when he saw one, and he saw one here. And he began to wander around. He began to read. He was a voracious reader anyway, a very fast reader. And he read all about Joshua Chamberlain, and he read about Longstreet, and he read Longstreet's memoirs. He started picking up things while we were here. And the key was when he and I, my mother and my sister was much smaller, but my mother was sort of, I wouldn't say bored, but she was one of what we call the backseat people.
Yeah, less than interested.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so my father and I went over to the Virginia Monument, the Lee statue, and we walked Pickett's Charge. And as we're walking across the field, he's telling me the story. I mean, I didn't know. Right. And he's telling me the story of Hancock and Armistead. And I've heard, and I'll comment on this later, about the backlash about that story. But we're walking across the field, and as he's telling the story, this is what he did. This is how he told his stories. He was the character. He was Armistead.
Okay.
And we're walking across the ground. He's telling me the whole thing. We cross the Emmitsburg Road. We start going up the hill. And he's more and more animated about this, and he's talking about what's happening. We get to the stone wall where you step over, walking up the hill a little more, and there is the little concrete monument to Armistead, and it's the place where Armistead fell. Now, we didn't know what this thing was, and so we walk up, we kind of look at it. Here's a Confederate flag sticking in the ground,
right,
which is odd since you're on the Union side of the line. And my father looks at it, and he begins to weep. He tears up. I've never seen my father weep before.
Right.
That moment, and I realize, as I just said, he was Armistead.
Yeah.
And that right there, that moment changed his life, I think. It certainly changed mine. And that started the Odyssey. And it took him 7 years to write the manuscript for The Killer Angels. But it began at that moment when he knew this was a story he wanted to tell. So when we came, he was doing the research, and I have to point out, in his day, doing research was a whole lot tougher than it is now for me. I mean, I am so fortunate. We've got the internet, for one thing.
Big help.
In his day, you had library lending programs, or he would go to the FSU library. He was trying to track down, let's say, Longstreet's memoir. They don't have it. Well, they go to, the University of Georgia, or they go to University of Virginia, and they find a copy, they mail it down, you check it out. All of this takes months. And then he reads the book, he has to send it back. This is how he did his research, and I can remember the book stacked up in our family room as he was reading these things. That's why it took 7 years. In my case, I can do a book in a year and a half because literally with a credit card and looking at my computer screen, I can buy a used library for not a whole lot of money and get all these incredible treasures that he had to track down one by one.
Right.
So that process is going on in the late 60s. And we came back to Gettysburg. He came a couple of times. I came with him in 1970. I was 18.
And where are you living at this point?
We're in Tallahassee, Florida.
Florida still,
yeah,
okay.
Where Florida State is.
Okay.
And we came up here, and he still suffered a lot of the effects of his heart attack. He was not in real good shape physically. And so my job as the kid was to do the grunt work, to climb Big Round Top, for example, because what's up there? Well, we didn't know. To go down into Devil's Kitchen, to wander through Devil's Den, and all these places that physically were a little demanding. I remember going out at the high water mark, going out into the ground down the hill towards the Confederate position, and there was an outcropping of rock that was buried under a bunch of brush. And he was thrilled by this because he said, George Pickett writes that Pickett was accused of being a coward because he stayed back. He didn't go up with his men during the attack. And Pickett maintained that he got a lot closer than people thought because he hid behind an outcropping of rock. And people dismissed him and said, there is no outcropping of rock. Well, if you go out in about 100 yards off the high water mark, a little bit to the left, it's under a bunch of brush now. Yeah. At the time then, it was not. It was in the open. And we found it. And my father was thrilled. This is the perfect kind of thing to help him. So that was the process. And I have to say, that point in time when we were here was probably the best time of my life with my father. We had fun.
Sure.
And things changed quite a bit after that. But being here with him and watching that process certainly helped me. The one lesson that I took from that is walk the ground, walk in the footsteps. It's not about seeing ghosts. It's not about, I'm not a ghost chaser.
Me neither.
But it's about simply, as I've said many times to audiences, if I'm going to describe a hill to you, that my character's going up that hill with a rifle in his hands into the guns of the enemy, it's really better if I've seen that hill or walked on that hill myself.
Absolutely.
Instead of seeing a picture in a book.
Right.
And I think that was the lesson I got from my father by walking the ground at Gettysburg.
And that's a great lesson. We do tours from April through October called Get Out of the Car tours. And the whole purpose is to get out and walk through that field and find an outcropping of rocks that are now covered by brush, but there they are. You don't see that if you're driving by the angle. You don't see that outcropping you're talking about. But if you come the other way, you do.
Right. So
you got to get out and do that, and it's a great lesson. And when you're talking about, now I didn't come to Gettysburg until I was a senior in high school, but when you're talking about your experiences with your dad walking across Pickett's Charge, it just was reminding me of many trips that our family would take, and if we went to any historic spot, my dad was always like your dad, like he got into it. And he would try to get us to imagine what it was that were, because, you're a little kid, you hear all these words and you don't know what it is. But then he, tries to dumb it down for you and, imagine, 15,000 single shot muskets and you're coming across this, like that's my dad. So I get that. It's a nice thing. So he spends how many years writing The Killer Angels?
Took him 7 years.
6, 7, yeah, okay. Comes out in 1974.
70, yeah, came out in 74. He finished the manuscript in 71 and started shopping it.
Okay.
And it was turned down by 15 publishers. Finally, the David McKay Company, very small independent publisher in New York, picked it up. He got $3,500. I remember that. And they printed about 2,500 to 3,000 books for a first printing.
Okay.
Those first printings, those first editions today are worth a bunch.
Yeah.
They're very collectible. We have the few that my mother saved over the years that, it's like family heirlooms.
Right.
But he was bitterly disappointed trying to sell this book until David McKay came along. They printed the book in 1974, and in 1975, the telegram came from Columbia University. Congratulations, The Killer Angels has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction.
Wow.
I mean, that, if you think about, the fact that the book didn't sell. It didn't sell as hardcover. It didn't sell even with the Pulitzer Prize, it didn't sell. Think about that era, end of the Vietnam War. Nobody in this country wants to read a book about generals. It was about as out of fashion a subject as you can imagine, even though the fact that it won the Pulitzer Prize. An author wins a Pulitzer, he has every right to believe his ship has come in.
Sure.
That now everybody's going to clamor over his book. Whatever he wants to write next will be fought over, all of that stuff. None of that happened to my father.
Sales didn't even go up.
They moderately.
Like a little bump, but not a lot.
I mean, it was not a bestseller. It was never a bestseller.
Really?
Back then. And that was a bitter disappointment to him. He did get a writing contract with Doubleday to reprint his first book, The Broken Place. And then he wrote another sort of a Hitchcock sci-fi story that's not very good.
Okay.
And it was a reflection of some other things going on in his life. But the point of that is, if you think about what I just said, he wrote a book about a prize fighter who kills a guy in the ring. He writes a book about the Battle of Gettysburg. Then he writes a Hitchcock sci-fi story. Where's the continuity?
Yeah.
And the problem that publishers had with him is, and he said this was a quote. He said, I want to write what I want to write.
Yeah.
They want me to write what they want me to write. And he didn't understand that the whole idea behind publishing is to build an audience.
Right.
And he never tried to do that.
Yeah.
And, to his own, it was unfortunate that he just didn't do that because in his mind, he was never a successful writer, even with a Pulitzer Prize.
That's amazing. Now, so does he immediately begin working on another book, or how long does it take? Is he always writing, even if it's a short story or a poem or something? Like he's just always writing something?
Yes, always doing something. But I have to go back to 1972, because that's when he had his motorcycle accident. The motorcycle accident, he was in a coma for 3 months. It happened in Florence, Italy. He was over there with FSU. FSU has a Florence program they send students over there. They send faculty, and he was one of them.
Okay.
He was riding, he was a big man. I mean, he was like 6'2", 220. He's riding a Vespa, which, if you know motor scooters, it's this dinky little thing.
Yeah.
He had no business on a Vespa.
No.
Somebody ran him off the road. He cracked his skull pretty good. And he was out for 3 months. And I flew over that spring of 72, and he had recovered to the extent that it was very much like someone who's had a stroke. One side of his body wasn't useful.
Okay.
He walked with a cane. His speech was slurred. Fortunately for us in the reading community, Killer Angels was completed. Because had he been halfway through, it never would have happened. But that, even as he got healthier, that accident affected his writing. That's why I say the Herald, which was the Hitchcock sci-fi story, it just isn't very good because he just didn't have it anymore. What would happen to him? He'd sit down to write, as you just were saying before. He was always trying to write, but he would sit down to write, and after 10 minutes, he'd run out of gas. And that was, in the old days, he could write 5 or 6 hours at a time. Suddenly, it wasn't there. Yeah. The one thing he did, and this was in the late 70s, he started putting this together, a baseball story. He was so autobiographical about the stuff that he wrote. He loved baseball. Baseball was his thing. Growing up as a kid, I heard all about Willie Mays. Because he was a Giants fan. And he began to write a baseball story, and it's not very long. It's a good story. The writing is not The Killer Angels, but it's okay. And he tried to sell it to New York, and nobody would publish it. And another bitter disappointment. Well, the story deals with an aging pitcher. My father saw himself as this pitcher. Again, this is so autobiographical for him. A pitcher who's at the end of his career, who goes out to throw his one last game against the champs, the Yankees, and he throws a perfect game. And that story, the book was called For Love of the Game. Yep. Well, the book comes later. I'm getting ahead of myself. In the 80s, he got together with Ron Maxwell, the director, eventually the director and screenwriter of the film Gettysburg. Maxwell approached my father and said, hey, Killer Angels, this is a movie. They couldn't sell it to anybody. My father wrote his own screenplay, and a typical Hollywood, I've learned this, a typical Hollywood screenplay, about 120 pages. Right. For a movie like Gettysburg, it could be upwards of about 300 because it's a 4-hour movie. My father comes back to Maxwell with a 600-page screenplay.
It's a miniseries.
Basically, he just took his book and converted it to a screenplay. And Ron had to explain to him, no, that's not how it works. So again, they gave up. By the mid '80s, nothing was happening with Killer Angels, and again, a bitter disappointment for my father. His health began to deteriorate pretty heavily. The cigarettes had stopped by then because of the heart attack, but the rest of his lifestyle had not. He was deeply depressed. The effects of the motorcycle accident were telling on him definitely. In 1988, he had his second heart attack. He died in his sleep. He was 59 years old.
That's young.
That's young. And after that, my sister and I and my mother are going through all his effects, and we came across the manuscript for this baseball story. And I'd never heard of it. I had no idea. And we took it to New York. My sister and I took it to New York and just sort of flogged it around a little bit. And the Carroll and Graf, as a publisher doesn't exist anymore, they picked it up and they published it. Immediately, every production company in Hollywood contacted us. I mean, I had all these big stars calling their agents, calling the house. Oh, we don't sell that until we can get a look at it. Nobody had even read the book yet, but the synopsis of the book got out there, and finally. It was Universal Pictures, Kevin Costner with Universal. I remember. And they just blew everybody else out of the water and said, look, we want this thing and we're going to pay you. And so that worked for us. Well, the movie came out many years later. And I remember when the book was published, first of all, I get ahead of myself a lot.
That's okay.
I guess you're getting that.
We're still following you.
When the book actually came out in 1991, I remember 3 years after my father's death, sitting in a little restaurant in New York having lunch with the agent and the publisher, and here's the first copy of the book. And I'm holding this thing, and I'm getting very emotional because I realized this was a gift I could give to my father that he wasn't able to give to himself.
In life, yeah.
And that was pretty profound for me. When the movie came out, I realized I'm in the movie, by the way, for 1 second, and I would just not even worth talking about. But when the movie came out, it premiered in New York, and I'm sitting there in the theater with my mother and a bunch of other people that we know, and the credits come up on the screen, and it says, For Love of the Game, Kevin Costner, Kelly Preston, so forth, directed by Sam Raimi. And it comes up based on the novel by Michael Shara. Twice that I have sat in a theater at an opening night and watched that come up on the screen.
Yeah.
Twice my father didn't live to see it.
Yeah.
And so
that's the saddest part of the whole story to me, is that he never lived to see either one of those really take off.
When the film Gettysburg finally happened in 1993, it was because of Ted Turner. You know, Ron Maxwell had been unable to sell the script back in the 80s. 5 years after my father's death, the film comes out. Ted Turner came along, put up the money. We know the film is Gettysburg. The film made the book a #1 bestseller 19 years after it was published.
Amazing.
And 5 years after my father's death.
So earlier when you said it was never a bestseller, you were a little off.
Lifetime.
In his lifetime, it was
Right.
never a bestseller, but
That's
it
right.
has become one since.
Yep.
All right, so let's get to the movie then. It's interesting to me because his success with the book seems frustrated, I guess is a good word, right? It gets the Pulitzer, but like it's just the wrong time for the country to be wanting to read this type of stuff, and just all these things, and it's. And then Ron Maxwell sees it. He wants to make it into a movie, and he's 10 years he's trying to get that thing sold.
Right.
And it's kind of like the little engine that could. It's just because your dad didn't give up, and then later Michael Shara didn't. Or no, that's your dad. Ron Maxwell didn't give up. It finally comes to see the light. But when it becomes a movie, or when you guys are in talks to make it a movie, are you with Ron on this from the very beginning? No. So he finds this book separate from you. You don't know him ahead of time.
No, I had no idea who he was. Again, my father had died. I knew that Ron Maxwell, whoever this person is, held the rights.
Right.
And he was out there trying to sell it. We knew he'd had no luck over the years, and we were curious if maybe we should try to get the rights back and go out on our own. As the family, maybe we'd have more luck than Ron was having. And then all of a sudden, Ted Turner comes along. So
now, how does he come along? Does he just bump into Ron? Or
the story I've heard is that Ken Burns is responsible for this. That Ken Burns went, who loves the book,
right?
Who he's quoted on the cover of the book, that book changed his life and had him do the documentary on the Civil War because of reading Killer Angels.
Yeah.
And he went to Ted Turner and said, "There's a guy out there named Maxwell trying to make a movie. You need to read this book." And Turner got involved, and he put up, I think, $22 million was the number of his own money, and the result was an incredibly successful film.
Yeah.
And of course, that made the book incredibly successful as well, and still is to this day.
So, were you here when they were filming it?
I was here briefly. I was here for a few scenes. All the Sam Elliott stuff is where when I was here.
Did you get a cameo?
No, I didn't get. I would have been terrified. No. By the time the baseball film was made, that would be 6 years later. Yeah, then I was fine. I was arrogant enough.
Yeah, right. At that point, you're like, I deserve this. Yeah. So, what do you have any particular memories that you think the audience might like from the making of the film that you observed, or funny little anecdotes or anything?
Yeah, there were several. I know that there's the one scene where, and some of this stuff made the final cut. Some of it was left on the cutting room floor. Okay. But there's a scene where General Hood, Patrick Gorman, is a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
That General Hood has to ride over. It's something around Devil's Den. Well, they were filming over by the Eisenhower farm, or back, in that area, and it was getting late in the day, and the Turner people were kind of looking at the sky because it's getting a little bit dark. It's like 4 PM, and they needed to film. They needed to get the second unit over at Devil's Den to shoot something. And they say, well, okay, we got to load the horses up in the trucks, and all this is going to take forever to do it, and people are wringing their hands. And Patrick Gorman says, we'll just ride over.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got the guys who are playing his staff, who are all horsemen. I mean, They all know how to ride horses.
Yeah.
He says, we'll just ride over. So off they go. And I can imagine, full uniform, full accoutrement. I can imagine a family of 4 from Iowa, is out there walking around, and here comes General Hood and his staff riding by. And I just, if you were, if you had a sensibility about being a ghost hunter, that might have stopped you in your tracks a little bit.
Yeah. He told us that story, and the other end of it that you probably didn't witness because you weren't with him was that they came out of the woods. I'm guessing the way he's describing it is it's the old electric trolley path down in front of Devil's Den. And he said that they came out of the woods there and there was a bus of like Japanese tourists with their cameras. And he said the same thing. I wonder if they thought we were a bunch of ghosts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Now, I mean, I would have to. I'm putting myself in your shoes, and I'm there on the set of a movie that's based on a book that my father, who has passed away, has written. I mean, I can't imagine that you're pretty dispassionate this whole time. Like, you have to have gotten the chills many times.
I'm very nervous being there because I feel like I'm just a pretender. I had nothing to do with creating this book, and I felt very awkward. People were very nice and all kinds of accommodations. They took us out to the film set in a limo, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And all that was very nice, and everybody was nice to me. I almost knocked Sam Elliott over with his little lunch tray. It was very weird. Out in the middle of the field, there was a tent set up, and they had a buffet lunch for everybody, and they took a lunch break. And so that Ron told me, he says, "Oh, we'll go get you some lunch." And okay. So I walk over to this thing, I'm filling up my tray, and I turn around sort of abruptly and right into Sam Elliott. And he's in full General Buford uniform.
Yeah.
He's got a tray, and I just knock right into him. And I thought, great, I'm going to spill my tray all over General Buford. They're going to have to stop and clean his uniform. But I met Patrick Falsey for the first time, who plays A.P. Hill. I met several of the cast members. I met Stephen Lang for the first time as Pickett. It was an eye-opening experience. Anybody who's ever been on a movie set, one thing it does is it sort of shoots all your fantasies about movies. Yes. Because you see how they actually do things.
Yeah.
And how much stuff is green screen and how much stuff is special effects. And of course, today it's digitized. One of the things, I know Ron told me this when they were filming Pickett's Charge, it's pretty impressive.
Yes.
The camera's up on it's the only time in the film there's a crane that actually has the camera up in the air.
Right.
And so you're watching these, 4,000 reenactors coming across. Well, that's a third of who actually participated in the real battle. Today, with digital technology, you could take that 4,000 and create 12,000 out of it easily.
Yeah.
And it would look that much more impressive. But even saying that, the reenactors, what a job they did.
Yeah.
Without the reenactment community, that film could never have been made.
I mean, I think if you look at the Fredericksburg scene in Gods and Generals, like, it's very obvious they used computers in a lot of those wide shots.
Yeah.
And what I think Gettysburg got better in the filming is the Pickett's Charge. Like, okay, they have 4,000 or 5,000 reenactors there, but who the hell knows what 12,000 looks like? Right. How many people have really seen that, right? So if you can have some depth and you're doing tight shots that are, medium shots and everything, I think that they pull it off. And those are 5,000 individuals, not clones of 1,000 people, 5,000 or 5 times or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I don't know. But now, so while the filming is going on, or I shouldn't say it like that, maybe at some point, from what I understand, Ron Maxwell says to you something like, "Hey, you should write a prequel and a sequel," correct?
Well, it wasn't quite that blunt. It was after I was here, and I wrote him a letter, and I thanked him for the experience, and I sort of gave a tribute to my father. I appreciated his tribute to my father, and he liked the letter, and he called me back and he said, "You can write, because I've got your letter." And I mean, that was kind of strange to me. And he said, "Look, Ted Turner wants to make more movies. It was always about film." And wouldn't it be great to take your father's story, go in both directions, before and after, and start, before, go back to the beginning of the war, bring in the families, the wives, show why these guys went off to war, and all of that. And my first thought was, I'm not a writer. Some of my father's creative writing students from FSU had gone on to be writers. I mean, they were published authors. We should get in touch with some of these people, see if they'd like to do this. And I thought about it for about a week. And I remember calling Ron back and I said, I think this is something I'd like to try. And there was no arrogance about that. There was no, I'm going to be a writer. I mean, there was none of that. It was,
right.
And Ron and I had the conversation that I think he was putting my mind at ease. If whatever I do stinks, it goes into garbage.
Right.
I mean, nobody's
going to know. Yeah,
exactly. So, let's try to put a story together. And it was always about putting a story together that he would adapt for a screenplay.
Right.
Because it was always about the movie. So I write this manuscript, and I'm doing a lot of the research that my father had done, the same kind of stuff. I could not find his Longstreet. I tried to find the same character, and instead I went to Jackson. And so that's why in Gods and Generals you have Stonewall Jackson as a primary character. Longstreet's there,
sure,
but he's not the primary character. I had a hard time finding what my father found, and I think that's a good thing.
Now, when you say finding what your father found, are you saying seeing in Longstreet what your father saw in Longstreet to make a character out of, or
that's part of it. The other part is getting in his head. Because that's the way. I mean, that's what the Killer Angels is.
Yeah.
You're in the heads of these characters, and I knew that's what I had to try to do, and I couldn't do it with Longstreet.
I understand. Okay, so you decide. Now, how hard is it? Now, you're not a writer. Before this ever comes about, you've never tried to write. Nothing.
No, I remember.
Not even like a funny limerick about one of your friends in college or anything.
No, okay. I remember looking at the computer screen when I started, and chapter 1, page 1, blank screen,
right?
And I laughed. So, what in the world are you doing?
Okay.
And I started going from there. And the first line of the story, which got cut because it applies to the Mexican War, which I did a later book, there were rocks large, the kind you climb with both hands.
Okay.
Ron read that and he said, "You just described your father's life."
Oh.
And I mean, that was a little intense.
That is pretty intense.
Yeah. So.
But it got cut.
It got cut. Well, it's
moved over to another book.
It's in Gone for Soldiers.
Yeah,
it's in the
you
Mexican
held on to
War
that
story.
line.
Yeah, I like the line.
It's a good line. Yeah. So you start writing it, and we'll get more in depth in this when we actually have you back on to talk about Gods and Generals. But just to give the audience a little bit of a tease, you start writing this without having ever been a writer, without ever even fantasizing about being a writer, and how long does it take you from when you laugh at that blank page to when you're actually on a roll?
About 18 months.
So a year and a half, you're sitting there essentially staring at a blank page.
Well, no. I mean, from the time I started staring at the page till the time the manuscript was completed was about a year and a half.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so about 18 months.
So, okay. Well, that's not that bad, though, for a first time out.
No, and I got grief for that.
Because it took you so little time?
Short, yeah, exactly. And I have it. I cut it out of the newspaper in Fredericksburg, Virginia. There is a critic, and he's a professor of Confederate studies at somewhere. And again, this is 25 years ago, so I don't think I'll offend him if he's still around. But he just took me apart. Who does this guy think he is? Telling this story, telling us what Robert E. Lee would say. I mean, how does he know this? And he starts naming other historians who, this person spent 10 years writing his book about Stonewall, and this person spent, and this guy writes a book in a year and a half, and he's just chopping me to bits. I was given the newspaper. I was on tour for the book. And I went to a bookstore in the Fredericksburg Mall, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Mall, and it was a B. Dalton or something back then.
I remember those.
And so I show up at this thing, and the guy says, he's really sort of sheepish. I don't know if you've seen the paper this morning. I said, no, I haven't seen anything. He says, well, I don't know if you want to read this or not. And he hands me it. And I read this, and of course, I don't know how to feel.
Right.
I mean, this is like, this guy's just eviscerated me. But then the guy, the bookstore manager says, well, but look here. And we go out in the mall itself, and there are 200 people standing in line.
There you go.
So he said, don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's what really matters.
Exactly.
The 200 people that are there. But it's still very hard when you read someone criticizing you like that.
It's hard for me.
Well, it's hard I think for anybody, especially, I mean, I'm imagining I'm you. I'm only here at this book signing because of what my father had done, and he's not here not solely because, but that's how it started.
Yes.
And he's not here. He wasn't here to enjoy the, fruition of his dreams and everything. And this jerk who doesn't know me, who doesn't know what I've been through, is just ripping me to shreds. Did the person ever mention that it's fiction?
Oh, I don't know. Actually, I don't even remember specifically, but I remember the opening line of the review, milking the last dime from the Michael Shara estate.
That's what I was going to ask you. Okay. Did you get a lot of that?
Not as much as I was afraid of getting. There was some. I remember being at a book signing actually in Culpeper, Virginia. It's funny how I remember the specifics of these things. And somebody came up to two guys came up to the table, and there's Gods and Generals sitting there, and the guy picks it up. He's looking, and his buddy says, he kind of nudges him and says, no, it's not the same guy. And they walk off. Well, it's like, and I actually said, and I shouldn't have done that. I was kind of tired and probably shot my mouth off. But as they're walking away, I said, it's not a competition. And it fell on deaf ears. But no, the negative reviews, at least I'm not my father. When my father got a negative review, he'd call the guy up.
Really?
I remember as a kid, there would be yelling into the phone, who the hell do you think you are? It's like, oh, man, you can't do that.
No, it doesn't do you any favors.
No, you have to just let it slide. But my father was not someone to let it slide, so I've had to build up a little more of a thick skin than he had.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, so where I was going before I got sidetracked, you didn't have any writing in your background, and then you start to write this, but you start to write it in the style of your father. Not that he invented that style of writing, but you're not a writer. So you didn't take any writing classes, I'm assuming. So you don't know all the different styles and the nuances of how to stick with those styles and all that stuff. And now here you are, not only writing a book for the first time, but now you're trying to capture the same style of writing as the Killer Angels.
That's not.
How hard is that?
No, that's not really accurate.
Okay.
Because it's not the style. Before I started writing, I read the Killer Angels.
Right.
I just reread it, and I've got to go back and do the prequel to this and have it end right where Killer Angels begins. And so I knew that. I knew the format, the going back and forth from the different characters.
Maybe format was the word I was looking for.
Moving through the timeline by the different characters. But what I learned pretty quickly, and actually at first, Ron Maxwell, when he read the first few chapters, he said, and my sister said the same thing, paraphrasing, this is being written by the ghost of our father. Yeah, okay. In other words, I'm just a conduit. Well, that doesn't give me a lot of credit, but that's okay. But as the book went on, I think, and I've had other people say this to me, I found a little more of my own voice. And what I learned, and people have often said, gee, this is like, the word I hear, seamless. This is seamless with the Killer Angels.
Okay.
I don't really want to hear that because that's, this is me.
Right.
There were people who said, this was a review and I came out of Texas. So what did this guy, Jeff Shara, do? He finds a manuscript in his father's effects and slaps his own name on it? I mean,
well, that's kind of a compliment.
It's a backhanded compliment.
Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, a lot of people. Then the other rumor, which still flies around, is that Michael Shara wrote most of Gods and Generals, and I just finished it. And I hate that.
I've never heard that one.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
but I mean that's. I know how much work I put into Gods and Generals. For people to assume that my father wrote it, it hurts.
Yeah, no shit. Don't you find people who? I mean, really, if you examine their their life and what they've contributed to the world, it's probably just a bratty kid. Right.
Right.
And that they have the nerve to sit behind their little keyboards there and rip apart someone who's worked, I mean, to write something, 18 months, 18 years, however long it takes, to write something, you're spilling your guts. It's a very intimate process that a writer goes through. And it's you. It's youth, these are all your best judgments, your best creative moments, whatever it may be. And then you throw it out there, and then all these people just start ripping it. It's tough, but you got to think of those 200 who are lined up to get the book signed.
Exactly. When I came to Gettysburg with Gods and Generals, I signed 5,000 books in a week. I mean,
the old been exhausted.
Yeah, I was fried.
Yeah,
the old Greystone store down in Steinware. We had people lined up down the street.
Yeah,
I'd signed 1,300 books that one afternoon. It was amazing. I mean, just incredible. My father never did that. Never had that experience. And so, what you said before. I mean, I'm feeling like an empty shell. I mean, I'm a pretender, and I used to say this to audiences. I'd hold up a copy of Gods and Generals. I'd say, it's very difficult for me to say, look what I did. This is his book. This was his book by rights he should have written. Ron Maxwell should have gone to him and said, we need to write a prequel.
Right.
Gods, and I will say, this is a big piece of trivia, and I've said this before, Gods and Generals was my father's original title for the Killer Angels. And he threw it out because whatever, they didn't like God in the title or something. And I remembered that, and it fit perfectly the story I was trying to tell. So I used it. It's not Shakespeare. It's not the Bible. It's places where people get titles.
Sure.
The Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Right.
No, it's original to my father. So there's a link right there that that I will always carry. But the idea that I didn't write this book, that it had to be his, that really stings. And,
sure.
And there's really nothing I can do about it. No. I just have to keep going with what I'm doing. After 18 books, I would think people might realize that I didn't find 18 manuscripts in his files and slap my name on them.
Yeah. They're not still giving you that criticism, are they?
I hear every now and then that, I always heard that, your father wrote most of Gods and Generals and you finished it. Even in the last couple of years.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, that's interesting, though, that was the original title of Killer Angels, because there is a line that Chamberlain has about nothing quite so much as God on earth as a general on the battlefield or something like that.
And that's exactly where the title came from.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Because I remember when Gods and Generals came out, I go, oh, that's cool. They took it from the line in Killer Angels, but that was the title. I didn't know that. Where did he get the Killer Angels from? That line that he gave Kilrain?
That's a little more, yes. It's a little more Shakespearean.
Yeah.
There's a chapter, the first Chamberlain chapter in the book, where Chamberlain talks about his father. And he talks about people would visit and Chamberlain would read different things. And I'm way paraphrasing here, but Chamberlain talks about his mother, who's very devout, and teaches Chamberlain the idealism of religion, of Christianity. And Chamberlain talks about that he always considered man is man is an angel. The Shakespeare line that there's a piece of angel. And I'm butchering the quotes, but and it's Chamberlain's father who says, well, if man's an angel, he's a murdering angel.
Okay.
And Chamberlain thinks man the killer angel. And that's where the title came from, ultimately. Now, in the movie, that's not there.
Right.
In the movie, it's in a whole different place. It's the conversation between Chamberlain and Kilrain sitting under the tree after they find the escaped slave. And Chamberlain says this to Kilrain, and Kilrain's response is, well, if man's an angel, he's a killer angel.
Right.
And that's where that comes from.
Now, is Kilrain your father?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, the difference is Kilrain's Irish.
Right.
My father was Italian.
Right.
But there weren't that many. There were lots of Irishmen at Gettysburg. There weren't that many Italians.
No. Just a handful, maybe. So, do you do that in any of your books where you make a character up that puts your opinion in? Or?
I wouldn't say I insert myself into the book, but there are sometimes will be character traits, little pieces of me, little pieces of dialogue that will have come from me. One thing I never do, and I've said this many times, if you ever see me in a book, if you ever see, it's me, or you hear my voice, then I'm a lousy writer because that should not happen.
Right. What was your dad's? I mean, obviously, if Buster is him, I'm sure he thinks that slavery is wrong and that you shouldn't judge people by the group because if you do, you're a peewit, I believe is the term he used. Right. But I mean, is that what was he like as a man? Like,
it's a tough question because he changed so radically over time. As a young man, idealistic certainly. His writing from the early days, the old sci-fi stuff, was all about adventure and finding new things and discovery and all of that. I think the writing business changed him when he wrote The Broken Place, and it bombed. He put an enormous amount of work into that and got no reward. And, Killer Angels, in a way, did the same thing. This book comes out, he wins the ultimate writing prize. Nobody cares. And so there was that bitterness increased. And, of course, the motorcycle accident is what changed him the most.
Yeah.
The heart attack changed him in a way that made him a little more aware of his own health, which is a good thing.
Sure.
But the motorcycle accident gave him pretty serious brain damage.
Yeah.
And the bitterness that he had in him affected his relationships with everyone, including me. We had a vicious argument on New Year's Eve, 1972, and I stormed out of the house, and that's the last time we spoke. And it took 15 years until he died.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, that's. I don't mean to air dirty laundry, but the result of that, he actually was quoted in a couple of different newspaper articles, interviews with him, that he described it. People asked him about his children, and he said, well, my son is dead.
Really?
Yeah, and the person I heard that from, of all people, was Katie Couric on the Today Show.
Okay.
It was fabulous. They were interviewing me on the Today Show when Gods and Generals came out, and she brings that up. And it completely catches me totally off guard.
And you had never heard that before?
I'd never heard it. And I made the best of it I could, in the interview. But but it's funny. I didn't have the impact of that on me was not like I wasn't devastated by it because I knew him. I knew what he had alienated his brother.
Yeah.
He had alienated his father. My sister was pulling away from him pretty heavily. So he was a bitterly unhappy man with major health problems, and
a head injury,
and a head injury to match, and it affected everything he did.
Yeah. Well, you get a head injury, it's you may be still around, but you're not you again.
That's right.
Even if it's slight.
And his writing reflects that, and that hurt him more than anything because he could never write another Killer Angels.
Right.
He wanted to write, at the time of his death, he was working on a manuscript on the life of Shakespeare. He wanted to write a novel about Shakespeare the way Killer Angels is written from Shakespeare's own point of view. He couldn't do it. He'd lost whatever that ingredient is. He'd lost it.
What was the For the Love of the Game? That didn't come out till after he was already gone. Right. But when did he write that? Was that prior to the Killer Angels? Or?
No, he wrote that in the 80s. But it's such because it's him and because it's his fantasy, he was able to put it together.
Okay,
he didn't have to do research. Nothing like that. It's his. It's the story he wishes was his.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that was my next question. So then when he died, but you did talk to him before he died, like you guys did. Oh, no, never.
No.
So he died and...
No, we never had any kind of reconciliation.
This is everything you've done since he died is your reconciliation.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the way I take it.
Yeah.
The things... I was able to get For Love of the Game published when he couldn't.
Yeah.
We were able to get a movie made that he couldn't. The movie Gettysburg came out that he couldn't do.
Sure.
And his name... Killer Angels today is in its 129th printing.
Wow.
There are not many books you can say that about.
No.
It's still, every year, it sells, tens of thousands of copies to new readers, people that are, discovering it and coming to Gettysburg for the first time. Mm-hmm. What greater tribute to my father is than that?
Well, that and it's required reading in many military academies. Where else did I read?
Well, Command and Staff at Leavenworth, Carlisle Barracks.
Everywhere, yeah. Mm-hmm. Carlisle Barracks. It was a whole list of things. The Citadel.
Yep.
Probably VMI. I don't know. That's a tremendous legacy for him to have. when people ask me, like, oh, I'm new to this whole thing, what's a good book to get started with? And if they've never read a history book about it, I always tell them to get the Killer Angels. And then I tell them that the trilogy, Gods and Generals, Killer Angels, Last Full Measure, if they wanted to get those to just get a better understanding of the whole war, that those are good because they're good reads. They're not hard to read. They're very easy to read. And I actually listened to the Killer Angels on Audible. It might have been spring, summer, so I don't know, like whatever. Earlier this year, for the second time, and the guy who have you ever heard it on Audible?
Oh yeah,
yeah. The guy who reads it does a great job because he does a voice for every character, but he's really good at it, and he takes his time delivering the lines of their thoughts or the dialogue or whatever. And when you hear it like that, you realize just how good it is as a work because you could just feel it. It's really good. And I mean, it got the ball rolling for all of us. Ken Burns, us, two big media moguls.
Well, it's funny you talk about the audio book. When Gods and Generals came out, I volunteered. To my publisher, to Random House, and I said, I'll be happy to do the audiobook. I'll read it. I can do that. And then I went in the studio with the guy they had reading it, and I watched the process and what it takes. Mm-hmm. Every paragraph is a take.
Yep.
And there's a director. And he'll say, cut, okay, go back and read that one again. You slurred one word or one thing wasn't pronounced correctly. I was floored by the amount of labor in one of those things. Then I felt like an idiot for, thinking I could do this. But you're right. What you described is every character has a different voice.
Yes.
And I mean, when my books on the American Revolution came out, Victor Garber, who's in Titanic, he's in the movie Titanic, is a great British actor. And he reads Rise to Rebellion. And he gets the British, very British, King's English sort of accent compared to the lower down British accent. And, I mean, all those little nuances you don't even think about.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the other thing, too, about, writing characters or like a character-based story like The Killer Angels is that, like you said before, you have to be able to get into the head of these characters. You can't just like go and read their journal or their diary or letters or whatever and hear what their opinions were and then just throw them in there. You gotta like imagine, okay, I'm Longstreet, my kids died and not too long, but now I'm back at this war. Like, how am I feeling? Or I'm Lee, I'm tired, I'm not feeling well, and all this stuff. And like, how am I going to speak and how am I going to act? There's a lot that goes into this stuff, and I think people don't realize. And the thing you're talking about with the audio book, someone had asked me, they're like, because he just wrote a book, which is pretty good. And he said, I'd love it if you would do the audiobook for it. And I said, are you out of your mind? I said, I don't have the time to do that. I mean, that's a lot of time.
Yes.
And I wouldn't be just the guy reading it. I would be the guy reading it. I would be the director. I would be the editor. I would do it all. How many more hours are they going to add to the day for me so that I could do that for you? I was flattered, but like it is a lot of work. And if you slightly slur one word in a paragraph, you at least got to go back and do that sentence again, if not the whole thing. Yeah, no, it's a pain. And the money isn't good.
No.
Like, unless you're one of those guys.
Well, except what they do in New York, what I found out by learning this process, is in New York, back when they were soap operas, there are not many now, but soap opera actors don't make a lot of money, but they're actors.
Yeah.
And they have a voice, and they have that wonderful sort of melodious kind of a voice, and that's who they use often is either that or stage actors, people on Broadway, again, who don't make a lot of money, so they take a gig wherever they can get it.
Right. And they're not like if you were to get me to go in there and do that, it would be, like 20 hours worth of recording, and it's mostly me stumbling over my words. Whereas a professional, like a stage actor or a soap actor, they'd come in there and they'd fumble maybe 3 or 4 times, and it would probably be like 4 hours of raw audio that you would just cut that. Who knows? But all right. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
It was very nice to talk to you. It's like another big star that we've had in here. Tom Berenger and Jeff Shara. We've had a couple. I'd love to have you come back on, talk more about your career and the books 18 books you've written. I've got to catch up.
Get with the program.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so 18 books. We'll talk about a good deal of them next time that you come on. And that's about it. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching or listening. And we will talk to you next time. Oh, before I forget, and then I'll ask you the question. If you don't mind taking this, moving that flag behind you, and signing our wall of fame.